Abigail, you are simply too clinical. That was the diagnosis my mother gave me. Standing in the center of her pristine Chicago living room, she delivered the news with the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. She told me that Trevor, my boyfriend of 3 years, was not just leaving me, he was marrying Stephanie, my sister. Why? Because Stephanie looked the part of a successful plastic surgeon's wife. And I was just a lab rat. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just felt the cold. A metallic click of a lock, snapping shut inside my chest. I was not a daughter anymore. I was a liability they were finally writing off. Before I tell you how I turned this clinical nightmare into a multi-million-dollar empire, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I love seeing how global our community is. I did not have to look far for the evidence of my own erasure. It was written into the architecture of that house. Upstairs, Stephanie had a dressing room with mirrors on every wall. A shrine to her reflection. Downstairs, in the retrofitted basement that smelled of isopropyl alcohol and ozone, I had my lab. For 20 years. That had been the arrangement. Stephanie was the show pony, groomed for the winner's circle. I was the draft horse, bred for labor. My mother, Susan. I liked to tell her friends at the country club that I was intense, a word she used as a polite synonym for unlovable. But she never complained about my intensity when I was ghostwriting Stephanie's college admission essays. She never called me too clinical when I restructured her investment portfolio to save them from a market crash 3 years ago. I was useful. That was the only currency I was allowed to trade in. Standing there, watching Trevor look at his shoes, brand new Italian leather that I knew my parents had likely paid for, I realized the full scope of the transaction. They were not just swapping one sister for another. They were upgrading their aesthetic. Trevor needed a wife who could host galas and look good on a magazine cover. I was an asset that didn't fit the brand guidelines anymore. My mother put a hand on my arm. Her nails perfectly manicured, sharp as talons. She told me I would be happier this way. She said I could finally focus on my little experiments without the distraction of a relationship. She framed my devastation as a favor. And in that moment, the variable shifted. I looked at Trevor. I looked at Stephanie, who was already beaming, practicing her new role. And I realized I was not competing for a prize. I was fighting for a participation trophy in a game I despised. Why was I trying to be chosen by a man whose greatest ambition was to be a mediocre plastic surgeon? Why was I begging for a seat at a table where the only conversation was about appearances? I felt a sudden, violent surge of clarity. It wasn't anger. It was evolution. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for an explanation or list the years of invisible labor I had poured into this family. I simply turned around and walked out the front door. I went straight to my apartment. I packed my life into the back of my sedan. It didn't take long. My life was lean, efficient. I took my servers, my research notes, and the prototype sequencer I had built from scrap parts. I left the furniture. I left the clothes my mother had bought me in a futile attempt to make me presentable. I drove south. Chicago faded in the rearview mirror. A gray skyline of old money and cold expectations. I didn't stop until the humidity hit me. Until the horizon opened up wide and flat. Austin, Texas. I didn't go there to find a husband. I didn't go there to be chosen. I went there to build an empire where the only thing that mattered was the data. I was done being the accessory. I was going to be the architect. Austin took me in. But it didn't coddle me. For 5 years. I didn't date. I didn't socialize. I worked. I slept on a cot in the back of a rented warehouse until the hum of the servers became my lullaby. I turned my grief into code and my resentment into revenue. By the time Helix Prime went public, The market valued us at $650 million. That number felt abstract to most people. To me, it was a very specific measurement of the distance between who I was and who my family thought I was. But wealth wasn't the variable that changed the equation. Justin was. We didn't meet at a country club mixer or a charity ball. I met him in the crossfire of a Q&A session at a bioethics summit. He stood up, microphone in hand, and didn't comment on my smile or my tone. He challenged my data on CRISPR gene editing. He found a flaw in my hypothesis. For the first time in my life, a man looked at me and saw a peer, not a prop. Justin was a venture capitalist in the biotech space. But he possessed the soul of an engineer. He didn't want a trophy wife to hang on his arm. He wanted a partner to build a legacy with. Our first date wasn't dinner and a movie. It was 4 hours of debating ethical frameworks over cold pizza. When he looked at me, he didn't see a clinical, unlovable woman. He saw a mind that matched his own. We built a life that was the inverse of my parents' marriage. There were no power plays. No silent treatments. Just brutal, beautiful honesty. But even with the millions in the bank and a ring on my finger that Justin bought because he liked the geometry, not the status, I still found myself waking up at 3 a.m. sweating. The ghosts of Chicago didn't vanish just because I changed zip codes. I used to wonder why I stayed so long. Why did I let my mother treat me like a servant for 20 years? Why did I let Stephanie steal my credit and Trevor steal my time? I wasn't stupid. I was a genius in my field. So, why was I such a fool in that house? It took me years to diagnose the pathology. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. It is the invisible chain that keeps a full-grown elephant tied to a flimsy plastic stake. When the elephant is a baby, the chain is too strong to break. It pulls and fights until it learns that escape is impossible. So, when it grows up and becomes strong enough to snap that chain like a thread, it doesn't even try. It has learned that it is weak. My mother didn't just insult me. She conditioned me. She spent 2 decades systematically teaching me that my intellect was a deformity and my compliance was the only thing that made me improved. I didn't leave sooner because I didn't know the door was unlocked. I didn't know the chain was just a mental construct. But Austin had broken the conditioning. I wasn't the elephant anymore. I was the stampede. And just as I was finally settling into this new, sovereign skin, the phone rang. It wasn't a number I recognized. But the area code hit me like a splash of liquid nitrogen. 312. Chicago. The past wasn't done with me. It was coming to collect. I answered the phone on the 3rd ring. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Abigail. We need you home. No greeting. No how are you. Just the immediate assumption that I was a resource sitting on a shelf, waiting to be deployed. It was my mother. Susan. Her voice hadn't aged, but it had thinned. Like fabric stretched too tight over a frame. Your father isn't doing well, she continued. Her tone clipped. His heart. And the family trust is a disaster. Trevor's practice is experiencing some headwinds. We need someone to organize the accounts. You know how you are with paperwork. There it was. You know how you are. Not we miss you. But we need your administrative labor. They weren't calling a daughter, they were calling an unpaid consultant. The audacity was so breathtaking, it almost felt like a physical weight in the room. They had discarded me 5 years ago. And now that their financial ecosystem was collapsing, they wanted the lab rat back to run the maze. I looked at Justin across the kitchen island. He was watching me. His expression, perfectly neutral. Letting me lead. I'm not coming to Chicago. Mother. I said. This isn't a request. Abigail. It's family duty. I'm not coming to Chicago. I repeated, my voice flat. But if you need to discuss the trust, you can come here. To Austin. I'll send a plane. I could hear the hesitation on the line. The idea of traveling to me, of entering my territory, was distasteful to her. But desperation has a way of lowering standards. She agreed. They would arrive on Friday. I hung up. I didn't feel anxiety. I felt the cold. A sharp focus of a scientist preparing a slide. Why? Justin asked quietly. Why let them in? Because I need to understand the variables. I said. They're hiding something. Trevor's practice isn't just facing headwinds. You don't call the daughter you disowned unless you are bleeding out. But I wasn't going into this blind. I had spent years managing my parents' digital lives before I left passwords, cloud accounts, server backups. I knew their digital hygiene was non-existent. That night, I sat in my home office, a room larger than my entire apartment in Chicago, and I initiated a forensic audit of the family cloud. I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for the timeline. I wanted to know exactly when the rot had set in. I sifted through thousands of emails, tax documents, and archived chats. It was tedious work. The kind I used to do for them for free. And then, in a folder marked 2014, correspondence, I found the anomaly. It was a PDF. A letter from the prestigious molecular biology fellowship in California I had applied to right after college. I remembered that summer vividly. I remembered checking the mail every day, waiting for an answer, and finally receiving a thin envelope telling me I hadn't made the cut. That rejection had been the reason I stayed in Chicago. It was the reason I stayed trapped in that house for another 3 years, believing I wasn't good enough for the big leagues. But the file on the screen wasn't a rejection. It was an acceptance letter. We are pleased to offer you a full stipend. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I checked the metadata. The email had been received on June 14th, 2014. It had been opened. Then, it had been moved to the trash. Then I found the reply. Sent from my account. But time-stamped at a time I was working a double shift at the lab. Thank you for the offer. But I must decline due to family obligations. My mother hadn't just discouraged me. She had impersonated me. She had intercepted the opportunity that would have given me my freedom, deleted it, and forged a rejection to keep me domestic, compliant, and useful. She had stolen 3 years of my life, not by accident, but by design. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. The last vestige of guilt I felt about leaving them evaporated. This wasn't just a toxic family dynamic anymore. It was a crime scene. And the perpetrators were coming to my house for dinner. The sun was setting over the Texas hill country when the rental car crunched up the gravel drive. It was a black SUV. Polished to a mirror shine, a rental. Clearly chosen to project a status they could no longer afford. I stood on the cantilevered balcony of the second floor, watching them through the glass railing. My house wasn't built to impress neighbors. I didn't have any within 2 miles. It was built for clarity. It was a hyper-modern structure of concrete, steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass, designed to dissolve the barrier between the interior and the raw, scrubby landscape. To the uninitiated, it looked severe. To me, it looked like freedom. I watched Stephanie step out first. She was wearing heels that sank immediately into the gravel. She stumbled, swore, and then looked up. Her jaw didn't drop, but her eyes widened in a way she couldn't control. She was scanning for the brand names, the obvious markers of wealth: gold leaf, marble statues, ostentatious fountains. She found none. Just clean lines and brutalist efficiency. Trevor got out next. He didn't look at the architecture. He looked at the expanse of the land, doing the mental math of the acreage. I could see the calculation in his posture, the sudden realization that the headwinds facing his practice were a gentle breeze compared to the hurricane of capital sitting on this hill. Then my mother emerged. Susan. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her hair, and put on her face that tight, practice smile she used for waiters and subordinates. She walked toward the front door, not as a guest, but as an inspector. I went down to meet them. Justin stood by the massive pivot door, his hand resting casually on the handle. He opened it before they could ring the bell. "Welcome," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. My mother stopped on the threshold. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, into the atrium, where a 20-foot living tree grew through the center of the house, illuminated by skylights. "It's a bit sterile, isn't it?" she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "It feels like a clinic. But I suppose that suits you." Abigail. She was trying to reframe the narrative. She was trying to turn my sanctuary into a mistake. But as I watched her clutch her designer handbag, a bag that was likely 3 seasons old, and charged to a maxed-out credit card, I didn't feel the old sting of inadequacy. I felt a sudden, clinical fascination. I was witnessing a psychological phenomenon in real time. It is the delusion of power of the empty wallet. For my mother, power had always been a costume. It was something you purchased and wore. It was the right car, the right zip code, the right husband. Her entire identity was constructed on the premise of having. She believed that if she possessed the symbols of value, she became valuable. But standing in my foyer, she was confronted with a terrifying reality, the difference between having and being. I didn't just have money. I was the asset. This house wasn't a display case for things I had bought. It was an extension of the mind I had built. My value was intrinsic. It was in the patents, the code, the research that lived in my head. If you stripped away the house, the cars, and the bank accounts, I would still be the CEO of Helix Prime. If you stripped Susan of her country club membership and her colonial house in Chicago, what was left? Nothing. A void, where a personality should be. She was terrified of my house, not because it was cold, but because it was authentic. It didn't need to shout to be heard. "We find it peaceful," I said, my voice flat. "It helps with the thinking." "You remember thinking, don't you, Mother?" She flinched. "Just a fraction." "Where is your father?" she asked. "Pivoting. He's exhausted. This travel is hard on him. He's in the guest wing." I said, "It's fully accessible. I'll have the staff take his bags." Staff Stephanie perked up, her eyes lighting with a predatory gleam. "You have staff. We have a team." Justin corrected. "Dinner is in 30 minutes. Don't be late." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. He didn't offer to carry their bags. He didn't offer them a drink. He treated them exactly as they were uninvited variables in a controlled environment. I watched them shuffle toward the guest wing, bickering in hushed tones about the humidity. They thought they were here to save their lifestyle. They didn't realize they had just walked into an autopsy. The specimen had arrived. Now, it was time to open it up. The dinner table was a long slab of polished concrete, set with minimalist place settings. There were no flowers, no candles, no distractions, just the food and the tension. Thick enough to chew. Trevor was sweating. He kept wiping his palms on his napkin, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He wasn't eating. He was rehearsing. I knew the signs. He was about to pitch. "So, Justin," he started, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room. I was looking at your portfolio. Impressive stuff. Very diverse. Justin didn't look up from his meal. We like diverse. Right. Well, I've been working on something myself. A revolutionary medical device. Non-invasive skin tightening. It's going to change the aesthetic market. We just need a strategic partner to get through the FDA trials. Someone with vision. He was pitching my husband as if Justin were just a wallet with legs. He didn't see the man, he saw the capital. Justin put down his fork. He looked at Trevor with a calm, unblinking stare. I'm familiar with the project. Trevor, he said. You sent the pitch deck to Vanguard Capital 4 months ago. And again last week. Trevor froze. Vanguard, I didn't know you were associated with them. I am Vanguard. Justin said. I'm the managing partner. And I'm the one who rejected your application this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing shut. Stephanie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My mother stopped chewing. Rejected, Trevor whispered. But why? It's a gold mine. It's a liability. Justin corrected. We did our due diligence. Your practice is leveraged at 300%. You're using new loans to pay off old interest. And the revolutionary technology, it's a rebrand of a failed patent from 2012. We don't invest in smoke and mirrors. Trevor. And we certainly don't invest in people who lack ethical grounding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stated facts. And those facts dismantled Trevor's entire existence in under 30 seconds. My mother found her voice first. This is a misunderstanding. Surely. As family, I interrupted. I reached under the table and pulled out a manila folder. I slid it across the concrete surface. It stopped right in front of Susan. Speaking of family ethics, I said, open it. She hesitated. Her hand trembled as she lifted the cover. Inside was the printout of the email. The acceptance letter from the fellowship. The time-stamped deletion. The forged rejection sent from my account. She stared at it. She didn't deny it. She didn't look confused. She looked caught. You intercepted my future, I said, my voice shaking just a little. Not with sadness, but with the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. You stole 3 years of my life. You kept me in that basement, running your errands and fixing your mistakes, because you were terrified I would leave, and you would have no one left to use. Stephanie leaned over to look at the paper. What is this? It's proof, I said. Proof that I wasn't unlovable. I wasn't too clinical. I was sabotage-worthy. I was so valuable to this family that you had to commit fraud to keep me. Susan slammed the folder shut. Her face was red, her composure shattering. I did it for you, she screamed. You weren't ready. You were socially awkward. You would have failed out there alone. I was protecting you. You were protecting your asset. I countered. You needed a manager for your portfolio and a ghostwriter for Stephanie. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted staff. How dare you? She hissed. After everything I gave you, you gave me nothing. I said, standing up. I built this. I built Helix Prime. I built this house. I built this life. And I did it despite you. Not because of you. I looked at Trevor, who was slumped in his chair, defeated. I looked at Stephanie, who was realizing for the first time that her golden cage was unlocked. But she was too afraid to fly. And I looked at my mother, a woman who had spent her life curating an image of perfection, now exposed as a petty, frightened fraud. The investment is declined, I said. The free labor is finished. And dinner is over. I didn't wait for them to argue. I walked out of the room, leaving them with the cold, hard data of their own failures. The autopsy was complete. The cause of death was ego. My mother didn't scream. She didn't cry. For the first time in her life, she was rendered completely silent by the sheer weight of her own irrelevance. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was on the table. And the bank account was empty. They packed their bags in under 10 minutes. I stood by the front door, watching them file out. Stephanie wouldn't look at me. She walked past with her head down, clutching her phone like a lifeline, probably already deleting the photos she had taken of my house. Realizing she couldn't claim any of this proximity for her social feed, Trevor looked like a man walking to the gallows. He knew what was waiting for him in Chicago bankruptcy courts and a dissolved reputation. My mother stopped in the doorway. She opened her mouth, perhaps to launch one last guilt trip. One final attempt to reframe her cruelty as maternal protection. But she looked at the stone walls, the vast atrium, the empire I had built from the ashes of her rejection. And she closed her mouth. She realized, finally, that her approval was a currency I no longer accepted. Then came my father. Robert. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. He stopped in front of me. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in a decade. He gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. He was a man who had spent his life deferring to his wife's delusions to keep the peace. And in that nod, he was admitting that I was the only one who had survived the toxicity of that house intact. I watched the black SUV disappear down the long gravel drive until the taillights were swallowed by the Texas night. Later, I found Justin in the lab. It's a separate structure on the property. A glass cube overlooking the valley where I do my private research. He was sitting on a stool, looking at a sequence on the monitor. "You okay?" he asked. He didn't touch me. He knew I needed space to process the data. "I am," I said, and I meant it. I walked over to the window and looked at my reflection against the dark glass. For years, I had carried a heavy, dense knot of guilt in my chest, the feeling that by leaving them, I had violated some fundamental law of nature, that I had severed a bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. But standing there, in the quiet hum of the servers, I realized something about the nature of genetics. We are taught that DNA is destiny. We are told that blood is thicker than water, that the double helix binds us to our origins with an iron grip. But, as a geneticist, I know the truth. DNA is just code. It is a set of instructions. And sometimes, the code has errors. Sometimes, the sequence is flawed. In nature, when an organism encounters a hostile environment, it has two choices. It can perish, or it can mutate. It can rewrite its own code to survive. I turned to Justin. "I used to think I was defective," I said, "because I didn't fit into their sequence. But I wasn't defective. I was the evolution." Justin smiled. "And now," I said, leaning against him, "we build our own sequence. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It isn't the people who try to edit you into a shape that fits their narrative. Family is the people who help you identify the errors in the code and delete them. Family is the environment where you can thrive, not just survive." I had let go of the bloodline to find myself. I had stopped trying to be a good daughter to people who were bad parents. And in that empty space, where their approval used to be, I had built a life that was entirely Unapologetically mine. The lab rat had escaped the maze, and she wasn't looking back. If you have ever had to mutate to survive a toxic environment, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to know that their worth isn't determined by their family's approval. And don't forget to subscribe, because the best revenge is a life well lived.